Welcome to the Republican Professor. Today we have with us a very special guest, Dr. Jonathan Fuqua. Did I say your name right?
Close. It's Fuqua.
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 Okay. All right. Well, thanks for being here, Jonathan.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah. I love your background, and it's that old school vibe I'm getting. That's I don't know.
It fits my philosophical views and theological views well. Old school.
Nothing wrong with that. Sturdy,
That's right.
stands the test of time. Well, Jonathan, gosh, there's so many things that I would love to talk with you about. But I thought we would talk about common sense epistemology. And I think you're a great guy to take us through what that is. And everybody listening, if you think that common sense epistemology sounds pretty cool as far as the common sense part, you are in for a treat. If you don't know what epistemology is, what would you say epistemology is, Jonathan? Because we have a real life epistemologist sitting here.
Yeah, epistemology is the study of knowledge and similar states like justified belief and rational belief. In a nutshell, that's what it is. It comes from two Greek words, episteme and logos, the study of knowledge or understanding. So it's interesting because people go to university all the time to pursue knowledge. Might be knowledge in the scientific field like biology, or might be knowledge in mathematics, or might be something more practical like accounting or nursing. And they often don't pause to ask themselves a question of what knowledge is.
Right.
How do we get knowledge? What's the difference between a justified belief and an unjustified belief? And why does knowledge matter? People seem to assume answers to those questions without ever really thinking about them in any kind of detailed way. And so epistemology is the attempt to think about those things in a detailed way. As Chesterton once said, something like, to paraphrase Chesterton roughly, philosophy is simply thought that has been thought out. You're going to be influenced by thoughts, by ideas, one way or the other.
Oh, yeah.
And so if you don't do philosophy, you'll be influenced by ideas that have never been thought out.
Yeah.
And so if you want to be influenced by ideas that have been thought out, you've got to do philosophy. And that holds true with epistemology. When people make claims that we can't know that God exists, or we can't know that Jesus rose from the dead, or we can't know that certain moral claims are correct or incorrect, they're making assumptions about knowledge, usually without ever pausing to think very carefully about what knowledge is and what's required for it. So epistemology is the attempt to slow down and think carefully about those sorts of questions.
That's wonderful. And if you're, for those who want kind of like, tell me where this is going, for philosophy, you know what? I think I can accommodate that, at least for this episode, to some extent. And I what I'm going to do, guys, is I'm going to pull up one of Jonathan's papers, just so you can get a flavor for this guy. And I'm going to just scroll down to the conclusion. I'm going to scroll down to the last sentence. And you have to understand, this is an academic paper. It's very academic-y, but just so you can see where the rubber hits the road, what we're actually talking about, like the kind of crazy stuff that you'll learn in college, and what Jonathan, where he's taking a stand. So here I'm going to share your metaethical Morianism and evolutionary debunking conclusion, Jonathan, just so you know where I'm going on this.
Okay.
And I'm going to scroll down. If you didn't understand that title, don't worry. Can you see this, Jonathan?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So I'm already in the bibliography. Hold on, let me go back up here. Now I'm in the footnotes. So those of you don't know, they're not watching on YouTube, just listen carefully, okay? Here's the conclusion to the paper. If this particular view holds up, it turns out your belief, the one that the view that Jonathan's defending, if it holds up, It turns out your belief that raping children for fun is wrong. I should have warned you maybe that it was going to be bracing that's what we're talking about. Okay. We're talking about your belief that raping children for fun is wrong is just as rationally secure, at least in the face of philosophical arguments to the contrary, as your belief that you have hands is secure. So that's the last sentence in this academic paper, high level philosophy, professional philosophy. And I mean, I showed my wife this, some of this stuff, and I said, see if you can make heads or tails of this paragraph right here. She's looking at it. She was like, you know, she was like, S, you know, whenever S knows that P, S knows P rather than some other contrast position Q, this opens the possibility that S knows P rather than Q, but not, you know, she's like, I'm starting to, my eyes are starting to glaze over a little bit. And I was like, all right, well, that's all right. You just need to plug through it a little bit. But this is one of the papers we're going to be talking about that Jonathan wrote, Metaethical Morianism and Evolutionary Debunking. Jonathan, where did this thing get published?
Proceedings of the American Catholic Philosophical Association.
So you're saying that the Catholics are concerned that we know common sense morality, like rape
Yes,
is wrong?
that's right. In fact, I would say the whole Christian tradition presupposes that everyone possesses basic moral knowledge, because the idea of sin presupposes the idea of an objective moral law that you've transgressed. And to acknowledge your need for a savior, you have to first acknowledge that you're a sinner. But you can't know that you're a sinner unless you recognize the reality of an objective moral law that you've transgressed. And so I would say something like this position that moral knowledge is accessible and basic to the human person, at least to any cognitively mature, properly functioning human person, and that knowledge is more rationally secure than any skeptical arguments to the contrary. I would say that is part and parcel of the Christian view of morality.
That sounds very familiar.
Yeah, yeah.
Let me show you what's holding up my microphone stand here. You got America's Rifle. Okay, that's not what I was going to show you. it's
Oh yeah,
it's
Wayne
you see it?
Grudem. Yeah,
Yeah, Wayne Grudem, Systematic Theology. It's just like the nearest big book I had. So, but I thought
yeah.
it was kind of funny that um but
So that when you bring religion into the picture, you can see not only um, what you mentioned, Luke, that everyday moral knowledge is at stake in
yeah.
these high level academic debates, but also faith itself is seemingly on the line here as well, because the Christian message, even the message of Judaism or Islam or any religion that teaches that you need to repent of your moral wrongdoing in order to be right with the Creator,
Hmm.
that religion is not going to make any sense in a world where people don't believe in objective morality.
Right. Right. That makes perfect sense to me. What as I was going through your stuff here that we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about three of his articles, like at least three, I think. Probably that'll be enough for today, but I just it just hit me how crazy college is. Like I remember thinking in the 90s, I heard stories, about kind of stuff you get taught in college, and I remember thinking this just sounds crazy. It sounds crazy that some some kid that was raised in a good home walks on to the University of Colorado at Boulder, whatever school it is. And sometimes they're Christian schools. Sometimes they're like these mainline Christian schools that have drifted. And they come out believing that there is no such thing as objective morality. There's no truth in morality, which entails the position that you're not really rationally secure in believing that bracing thing you just said. Take like the most extreme horrible thing, and then you can't know that that's wrong. That just
Right,
follows. And
right.
And that's happening on a massive scale
Right.
all throughout the country and in the Western world, in Oxford, Cambridge,
Right.
Australia.
Even this kind of ugly example of raping children for fun is surprisingly, strikingly relevant.
Oh my
Because
gosh.
we now have an attempt to
That's
normalize
true.
pedophilia
That
by
is so.
redefining it
I
as
didn't even make the
a
connection that
right.
for the big film that just came out, because I haven't
Right,
seen
and
it. I
freedom.
haven't seen it.
And people on the far progressive left are trying to say that pedophilia that term should be replaced with minor
Wow.
attracted persons. That's a new sexual orientation, and there's not anything necessarily immoral about
Yeah, and we did
acting
not
on those
plan
desires.
this connection right here. We did not plan this at
No,
all. Like
no.
we were just now realizing, oh my gosh. I mean, how long ago did you write this paper?
Well, that's another funny aspect of this is that when I wrote this paper, well, this paper was published in 2018. I wrote it
Okay.
before that. I picked
You didn't
this
write it after
example.
it was published?
I picked this example because it's something that I figured would be uncontroversial. And 5 or 6 years ago, when I was working on this stuff, it was uncontroversial. But now I think people would be somewhat, at least some people, again on the sort of the far progressive left,
Yeah.
would be a little bit uncomfortable with this idea. They've been uncomfortable with the idea that sex with children is necessarily wrong. They would probably, some of them are wanting to say now that that doesn't really count as rape because there are minor attracted people, and after all, children can give their consent. I mean, if a minor can give consent to hormone therapy in order to change their from being a boy to a girl, or if they can consent to, as it's so-called, bottom surgery or a double mastectomy, if a 13-year-old can consent to that, why can't a 13-year-old consent to sex with an adult?
That
So there's a deep connection here between
man.
transgenderism
I
and
never thought
minor
about that
attracted.
I never
Yeah,
thought about that connection before. That's
yeah.
so creepy.
And so it's amazing how much the culture has shifted just in the last 5 years to where now all of a sudden this is an example that some people would be uncomfortable with. And some of my other work on this topic, Luke, I use a different example that I think is still uncontroversial, and that's that the idea that recreational genocide is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an example I picked up from another philosopher who works in this area. He's an Eastern Orthodox Christian, Terence Cuneo, a really excellent philosopher. I heard him give that example in a talk he gave, and I think most people would still agree that recreational genocide is wrong.
Yeah. And when we say we agree with it, what we mean is that it's true that it's wrong.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Um, you now I'm going to go back to that conclusion really quick because there was another thing that maybe people didn't see, and then we can get into G.E. Moore and like briefly who he is. The issue of having hands. And it's
Yeah.
like it's so fat. I mean, what in the world's going on with that? Like having hands.
Yeah. So this example comes from a famous proof for the existence of an external world. This is one of the questions that arises out of. Well, maybe we should back up just a bit. There's a lot
Okay.
of worries about skepticism that come from modern philosophy, beginning we could say roughly with Descartes. In the aftermath of Descartes and other early modern philosophers like Hume and Locke and Kant and others, Leibniz, Berkeley, and so forth, there are a lot of worries about whether we can really know that there's such a thing as an external world. And the thought is that until we can sort of prove or demonstrate or secure in some kind of philosophically respectable way the reliability of our basic faculties, we really can't do anything else. So metaphysics, natural theology, theology proper, revealed theology, this all takes a backseat to epistemology, and we kind of have in the classical tradition, metaphysics was considered prior to epistemology, had kind of priority over epistemology, and then in the modern period, that order is flipped. Epistemology becomes sort of prior to metaphysics. not because people are just simply curious about the way the human cognition works. That had always been a part of classical philosophy, but because they're specifically worried about skepticism. And so fast forward to the 20th century, there's a very famous British philosopher, G.E. Moore, George Edward Moore, very prominent and influential philosopher to this day, who says, well, you want proof that there's an external world. In fact, he's got an essay called Proof of an External World. He did this at and if I really do have hands, then there's an external world. That was sort of the basic idea. And Moore challenged skeptics and critics to point out, well, what's wrong with the argument? I mean, the conclusion follows from the premises. The premises seem true. It seems like I'm justified in believing these premises. And so the conclusion itself is not one of the premises. There's no circular reasoning. And so this seems like a sometime. Are you there, Luke?
Just had to check on my my internet.
Okay.
It's fine. We dropped off there. So we have it.
Okay, so should I continue?
Yeah, go ahead and continue.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so
I think we lost you right as you were saying what G.E. Moore was saying about having hands.
Yeah, he was saying that you can sort of give a perfectly respectable proof of the external world just by pointing out that you have hands, and that if you have hands, there's an external world.
Yeah. Now, can I ask what's an external world? What's external about it?
Yeah, it's the world outside of your mind.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And
Gotcha.
It's one of the big skeptical worries about in modern philosophy is, can we really know that there's a world outside of our mind? It could be, for example, that all the things we think exist outside of our minds, like our hands or other people or trees and dogs, maybe these are just hallucinations, or maybe we're dreaming, or maybe we've been tricked by an evil demon, or maybe we're in the Matrix or something like that.
Okay.
And the Moore says, no, we can know that there's an external world. In fact, we can give a respectable proof. I have hands. If I have hands, there's an external world. So there's an external world. And so there's a lot of debate about how to interpret what Moore was up to when he gave that famous proof. What was he being serious? What did he have his tongue in his cheek, or what was he doing? I think that for listeners who are interested in this, in my opinion, the best take on what Moore was up to is explained in a really good paper by the Georgetown philosopher John Greco, in a paper called "How to Read Moore," R-E-I-D Moore, where he interprets Moore as really following Thomas Reid on these matters. And Greco's point is that what Moore was trying to say is like something that he's trying to say what Reid said in part, which is that you shouldn't try to prove philosophically that you know things that you don't know by means of philosophical proofs, but rather that you know by in some other way. And how do we know there's an extra world? Not by philosophical proofs, but by perception. And so that was really Moore's point in giving that proof. But this kind of common sensus line in response to the skeptic goes under the banner of Moreanism or common sensism, or sometimes Readianism. And so in that language of Moreanism and Morean facts and Morean truths, Morean propositions, I'm sort of following the contemporary literature in the way that I put that. But it's really just a common sense response to the radical skeptic.
So there's a tradition in philosophy. Sometimes it's a way introduction to philosophy is taught, I think, where you introduce a skeptical scenario, and then come on, kids, see if you can get out of this, and then sometimes what's done is you look at the philosophical tradition and you see if there's any resources for getting out of it. I've always been a little bit puzzled about approaching philosophy that way. I mean, I'm not nitpicking or anything. I think it's fine. I mean, it can be beneficial, I think, but one of the things I've always been bothered by is just making sense of why there'd be a bunch of people in a classroom pretending like this is a problem when obviously you got to the classroom okay, and you're pretending that you hear the or maybe you're not pretending, you actually hear the professor and you believe the professor exists and the professor's right over there, and I'm writing on on a desk. I mean, it can feel a little bit weird, like
Yeah.
you're
I think-
there's something wrong with you for noticing all this common sense stuff,
Mhm.
and all these, you're surrounded by all these crazy leftists and they're pretending like, because I mean, in my tradition, like when I went to church, we never pretended that we were trapped inside of our own minds or anything like that. And so it seems it's a little bit bracing, but do you teach
Right.
philosophy that way, or do you think there's
No,
benefit?
I don't. Just a couple thoughts on that way of teaching. I mean, for one thing, I do think there's a way to approach skeptical arguments um, such that you're not worried about losing your ordinary knowledge, but you're trying to learn from the skeptic's argument positive truths about knowledge. So, okay, so the thing that's interesting about skepticism is that the premises of a skeptical argument are typically plausible, but they have a radically implausible conclusion.
Yes.
Kind of puzzle there. And so you could
Yes.
say, well, okay, I know the skeptic is wrong because I know that I have hands, I know that I exist, I know that recreational genocide is wrong.
Yeah.
And yet the premises of his argument are plausible. So I need to figure out what assumptions is a skeptic making about knowledge, and which one of those assumptions is wrong. And that can actually drive positive epistemology. So when you consider skepticism in that way, you're not doing so to try to undermine the knowledge of your students, but you're
Mm,
doing it because it helps to drive positive epistemology.
mm.
Um, and then, yeah, I had another thought, but I kind of lost it. But that's I think a reason, Luke, to take skepticism seriously, in a way of doing so that doesn't uh, lead to any kind of problematic loss of ordinary knowledge.
What would be plausible at all about these skeptical premises? 'Cause we say we're comparing
Yeah,
plausibility, right? Like
yeah,
a
right.
common sense conclusion is more
Yeah,
plausible
yeah,
than the somewhat plausible premises of the skeptic.
yeah,
Well, what would be plausible at all? Can you give us a
yeah.
flavor of that?
I'll give you an example. Yeah, here's one principle that you see in some skeptical arguments. It's called the Methodist requirement. And the idea is that all of your beliefs are arrived at using some method, whether it's perception or memory or intuition or inferential reasoning or what have you. But you can only have knowledge or justified belief uh, in some proposition that's produced using some method if you first know that that method is reliable. So to get perceptual knowledge, you have to first know that perception is reliable, or to get memorial knowledge, you have to know that memory is reliable.
Hmm.
Now that seems, I mean, on the face of it, right, without deeper investigation, that doesn't sound too crazy. It sounds somewhat almost sort of sophisticated, right? Oh, well, yeah, of course. I shouldn't be
Yeah.
just assuming that my perceptual faculties are reliable. I need some kind of evidence for that.
Hmm.
Um, that's an example of a skeptical principle, I think, that is plausible at first blush.
Hmm.
But when taken to its logical conclusion and put in tandem with other premises in an argument, lead to the conclusion that no one knows anything at all.
Hmm.
And that undermines skepticism itself, right? Because a skeptic is himself using some method to arrive at the premises in his skeptical argument. But if no one can know anything, in other words, if his conclusion is right, he can't know the premises of his own argument.
Yeah.
And so the whole
Or the
thing collapses
conclusion.
like the house of cards that it is.
Yeah. That's helpful. That's
So, and
helpful
that
for
that
me.
there's a, so the I mentioned that this kind of thinking can drive positive epistemology. So what's the lesson we learned from this? The lesson we learned from this is that in fact it is possible to arrive at knowledge using a method without first being able to prove that that method is reliable. And that's very,
Say that again.
yeah. The lesson we learned is that we can in fact use a method to gain knowledge without first being able to prove that that method is reliable. So I can use perception to
Is
gain
that called
perceptual
something?
knowledge. What's
That's
that?
is that called something? Everything has a
Um,
name, so you calling that particularism or?
Particularism, the idea that we can know particular propositions like, yeah, I have a hand, or I exist, or there are other people in the world. Particularism, it adopts that approach. Yes, that you can know particular truths about the world without first being able to explain how you know, or to prove that you know what you claim to know.
I'm familiar with something that Chisholm wrote.
Yeah,
And I think that, are you drawing from that, or are you drawing from
yeah.
something else?
Chisholm is in this common sense tradition. I would
Okay.
count Chisholm as a common sense philosopher.
Roderick Chisholm.
Yeah,
He's come
exactly.
up before on the podcast. Trent Doherty mentioned him.
Yes.
Trent
And this,
Doherty was ecstatic about Chisholm.
yeah, Chisholm is great. And this, Luke, this point about being able to know using a method without first proving the method is reliable is very congenial to common sense epistemology, because most people don't have theories that explain or prove that they know what they know.
Yeah, that's right.
And so if that's really a requirement on knowledge, then most ordinary people really wouldn't know anything. Only
Yeah.
specialists in epistemology would know anything,
Mm-hmm.
or cognitive scientists maybe. So yeah, so that's an example of how taking skepticism seriously can actually give you positive results in epistemology.
So you argue elsewhere, and we don't have to exactly go to the other paper right now exactly, but I think it'd be helpful if I just brought it up, and then we can jump back and forth if you want. Um, to the ecumenical Morianism
Yeah,
paper.
yeah,
Folks, if you're a little bit turned off by these isms and these specific labels because you're not totally familiar with it yet, just here's just some helpful advice I would give you, is that sometimes you just have to listen carefully and catch what you can, and that can be very helpful. The philosophers, academic philosophers, have a very technical language, and there's shorthand for a lot of things, and that's just so that they can make their own really difficult hard work faster and easier when they talk to each other. And sometimes it can be a little bit intimidating if you're coming at it from the outside. But what you mean by ecumenical Morianism in this paper is you're taking the good guy more, and I'm going to break it down a little bit. Hopefully, this is helpful. And when you study philosophy, you're going to want to find the good guys. and for the lack of a better term, you're going to want to, and feel free to push back on this, Jonathan, if you want. But what was helpful to me is I was looking for the good guys. I was like, who's on my team here? And I don't want to say that I know everything and I'm right and I'm just looking for people that are on my team. But when you're in these deep waters, you need help. I mean, you really do, because everything is up for grabs, and that's overwhelming. And that's probably why most people don't major in philosophy. But it's a very good exercise to go through this really deep work, and you want the right people helping you along. And thank God there are good people in philosophy that can help you. And so for me, the study of philosophy was about finding the right mentors, as it were, or the people that have common sense, the people that know what they're talking about. They're not idiots. They don't make stupid mistakes. They might make some mistakes, but they're not stupid mistakes. They're mistakes that I would have probably made. And a lot of people, we all make mistakes in how we think about things, but they they get certain basic things right, and they're
yeah.
not going to lead you astray on really important things.
No,
And
I think Luke, there's actually a really good reason for taking an approach like what you're describing. So if you think that philosophy really is a science in the broad classical sense of that term, like a science as a kind of scientia, the Latin word SCIE and TIA, meaning a
Mhm.
body of knowledge that starts from first principles and then using the tools of logic arrives at further knowledge through valid inferences. So if you think of philosophy as philosophy's been going on for a very long time, right, for thousands of years, and so It's important to note that the questions of philosophy cannot be answered by what we call the natural sciences. So geology and astronomy and physics can't tell us what the purpose or meaning of life is, what the nature of justice is, for example. And so in philosophy, in fact, predates modern natural science by millennia. So if philosophy is a science and that broad, old-fashioned understanding of the term, then it probably got true results a long time ago. People like Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, Thomas Reid, and others in this tradition probably got some true results a long time ago. And so you don't want to reinvent the wheel, right? If you wouldn't do that in any other field. If you start studying mathematics, psychology, you wouldn't throw out everything that previous mathematicians have discovered and start over from scratch yourself. You wouldn't get very far. You wouldn't do the same. You wouldn't do that in biology or chemistry either, or even in history. You would learn from those who have gained actual insight into the nature of reality before you. And I think it's the same when we do philosophy. Now, if, on the other hand, philosophy is not a science, if it doesn't really deliver knowledge, then why do it? It's just like doing Sudoku or playing chess. It has no transcendent, redeeming value. So people that commit their lives to philosophy, I think, are implicitly presupposing that this is a field which can deliver knowledge. But if it can, it likely did so a long time ago, which means we should be paying attention to the tradition of philosophy and finding people who have made these insights and trying to learn from them as best we can.
Oh, that's beautifully said. I'm really glad you said that. So G.E. Moore is one of the good guys, right? At
On
least
epistemology,
on some
he's one of the
things,
good
yeah.
guys.
Yeah.
He's also a utilitarian in normative ethics. So I would say there he falters.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, you can't have everything. And
Right.
it's rare to find
Right.
the guy that you're like, oh, that's the man. And then I don't have to do it because he already did it.
Right. Yeah.
Well, you got this other paper. Let's take a look
Okay.
at this other paper here.
Right.
You got Morianism. You argue that it's it's really a metaphilosophical position.
Right.
What's meta-philosophy?
Well, so that's a good question. People define that term and they mean different things by that term. What I mean by it in this context is that Morianism is not, or common sensism, Morianism, readingism. I'll probably use the term Morianism, but if you don't like that term, you feel free to substitute common sensism or readingism. Morianism is not an answer to traditional first order debates in epistemology about the nature of justification. For viewers that have some philosophical training, at least in epistemology, you would understand these terms when I say that Morianism is not an answer to the question of internalism versus externalism. It's not even really an answer to the question of foundationalism versus coherentism, although most common sensists are foundationalists. I argue in this paper that coherentists are free to be common sense philosophers too, and there actually are coherentists who are common sensists. Most prominent being William Lycan, Lycan, very
I did not
philosopher.
know that.
Yeah, who's a coherentist and a common sensist. But it's really by metaphilosophical, I mean it's sort of a higher order, second order perspective on what to do when you are faced with a skeptical argument that has a radical conclusion. And let's say you don't know how to answer it. What's the rational thing to do there? Should you suspend your ordinary judgment that you exist, that you have hands, there's an external world, that recreational genocide is wrong? Should you suspend judgment about all these things and become an agnostic until you've got a good philosophical proof for these propositions? Or is it more rational to maintain your ordinary, mundane, common sense knowledge, even though you can't answer for the moment the skeptic's challenge? And so Morianism says it's more rational for you to believe in these common sense propositions than it is to believe anything the skeptic is telling you.
Yes.
Common sense truths are epistemically superior to the skeptic's premises. And so you can, in virtue of that epistemic superiority, you can use your ordinary common sense, mundane knowledge to reject the skeptic's argument. You may not know exactly which premise in the skeptic's argument is flawed just yet, but you can know that there's a flaw in the argument somewhere. So an example of this that some of your viewers, Luke, might be familiar with, most people, even if they've never spent much time studying philosophy, are at least maybe heard of Zeno's paradoxes. Zeno was an ancient Greek philosopher who was a student of another ancient Greek philosopher named Parmenides. And Parmenides and Zeno both gave sophisticated arguments for the conclusion that change is impossible. Now, I would say there's almost nothing more obvious to us than that change is actual. And obviously, if it's actual, it's possible.
Yeah.
And so you have this standard paradox that you get with skeptical arguments of, some argument by Parmenides or Zeno might have seemingly plausible premises at first blush, but they lead to a completely implausible conclusion. And so what's the rational thing to do? Should you quit believing that change is real? No, of course not. You know that change is real. What the common sense philosopher says is that what you should do is say, well, I know that change is real. And if change is real, then Parmenides and Zeno are wrong somewhere. Therefore, Parmenides and Zeno are wrong somewhere. Now, if you're very philosophical, you might choose to try to figure out where Parmenides and Zeno get it wrong. But maybe you're not a philosophy student and you don't have time to think about Parmenides and Zeno's arguments. That's fine. You can move on with your life without having to worry about whether change is real.
Move on with your life. Yeah.
And this seems very unphilosophical because it seems to some people, to the critics of common sense philosophy, common sensism seems very unphilosophical, and therefore it seems like it's not very intellectually respectable. But I would say two things about that, Luke. For one thing, it's very philosophically respectable to believe what you have more reason to believe. And if it's really true that we have more reason to believe in common sense propositions than we do to believe whatever the skeptic is telling us, then the most rational thing to do is to stick with common sense. That's what's intellectually respectable, not giving that up for some fancy philosophical principle. And then I would say the other thing is that once you compare Morianism with the alternative responses to skeptical arguments, I think it's not difficult to see that it's really the most intellectually respectable option on the table. So I break the replies to skepticism down into a few different types. If you don't mind, Luke, I'll take just a couple minutes to go through them, maybe.
Sure.
So
before you do, hold on.
Yes.
You were talking about Zeno's paradox.
Yeah.
Okay. The way I've taught that in class is I move around in class and I say, he said that movement is impossible.
Yeah.
All right. Now, how do we articulate this? What's going on here?
Yeah.
You going to believe Zeno or your lying eyes? And
right.
That's
exactly.
one way to do it, right?
Yep.
So
precisely. Yeah. That's very similar to Moore's proof, right?
Right.
Hey, I've got hands, and if I do, there's an external world.
Yeah.
Exactly. And Thomas Reid said, why should we privilege reasoning over perception? In other words, why should we say that what he meant by that is, why should we think that perception is unable to give us knowledge unless it's first vindicated by reason? Because what you see in Parmenides and Zeno is a kind of disregarding of perception. We're going to take philosophical reasoning over perception.
That's right.
But what Reid said is that both of these faculties come from the same workshop, the divine workshop.
Oh, that's good.
And so if God
who said that? Who said the workshop?
Yeah, the divine. Yeah.
That's why it's familiar. I haven't read Reid in a while.
Yeah. And so if we're trusting that our reasoning faculties can be reliable because they ultimately can be traceable back to the divine workshop, then we also have to trust that our perceptual faculties can also be assumed to be reliable because they come from the same workshop as our reasoning faculties. And I think there's a point we can make off of that, which is that if you're an atheist and you think that your cognitive faculties are the product of a process which is blind and doesn't care about the truth, then you might have a good reason to worry about all of your cognitive faculties.
Yeah.
But if you're a theist and you think that there's a divine author that's ultimately the foundational explanation for your cognitive faculties, that gives you good reason to trust those faculties. Okay, so there's the concessive reply to skepticism, which that's just what skepticism is. It just gives up the game, bites the bullet, and says, "Yeah, we don't really know anything." There are other replies that are what I call partially concessive, and I'll just give one example of this. Contextualism is a theory of knowledge which says that the standards for knowledge change with the context. So in a philosophy classroom, the standards for knowledge are really high. We demand certainty or maximal justification, let's say. And you really can't have that for almost anything that you believe. And so in a philosophical context, you don't know that you have hands, let's say. But when you leave the philosophy classroom and you go on about your business, the standards for knowledge are operative in that context are different. They're lower and they're easier to meet. And so when you're just out, going for a run or playing basketball or, playing chess or whatever, there you really do know you have hands because the standards for knowledge in that context are lower. And this is a partially concessive reply because it concedes to the skeptic that when you start talking about philosophy, no one really knows anything. So I think that's not an ideal response. A third response is what I call potentially concessive.
Mm-hmm.
And I call it, and an example of that I give is what I call hyper-rationalism. And hyper-rationalism says that you can know that you have hands or whatever the skeptic is targeting. You can know that the skeptic is wrong only if you've got a proof or a philosophical argument that what the skeptic is saying is incorrect. Mm. And that sounds very intellectually respectable. The problem, Luke, is that most people don't have good philosophical arguments that the skeptic is wrong because most people aren't philosophers.
Right.
And even in the philosophical community, epistemology is only one subdiscipline within that whole field. So people that do philosophy of law or philosophy of art or political theory or whatever, ethics, mm-hmm. They might not know of any good responses to the skeptic. Are you telling me that those people don't know they have hands or they don't know that other minds exist?
Yeah.
Again, that just seems silly. And
well, especially if you have to write a philosophy paper with your hands.
With your hands, that's right.
And you got to turn it in or you're going to fail the class.
That's right.
I mean, it's well, how can I put that in the paper?
I think the only truly non-concessive reply to the skeptic that allows us to safely hold on to our ordinary knowledge is really the common sense reply, which says that you can know without a philosophical demonstration of where the skeptic goes wrong. You can know that the truths of common sense are actually that they're true, that those propositions are true. You can have that knowledge even if you can't prove that where the skeptic goes wrong. And that's the way we really operate, I think. I mean, no one actually really doubts whether they exist or whether they have hands or whether there are other minds, despite what they may say in print, despite what they may say at a philosophy conference, despite what they may say in the philosophy classroom. No one actually lives as if they don't know these things.
Yes. So there's an authenticity that you're noticing. It's right. An integrity issue. It's an authenticity issue. It's a living your life issue.
Right.
And you're looking for a theory because that's what philosophy does.
Right.
Wouldn't be philosophy otherwise. You're looking for a theory, a way to articulate this integrity that we have and when we live our life and what we believe about knowledge and reality and right and wrong.
Right.
For example,
the common sense philosopher assumes that human cognition is basically trustworthy. It's basically reliable, not infallible. No one's saying that human cognition is infallible. Only God has.
We're human.
Exactly. The error is human. Only God has an infallible cognition. The skeptic is assuming basically that human cognition is not reliable. But if human cognition is basically not reliable, why should we trust anything the skeptic is telling us? Why does the skeptic's philosophical reasoning get a pass when all other human cognition doesn't? I think there's a kind of deep incoherence in the whole skeptical project. And I think the common sense answer is much more is much more faithful to the way that we actually live our lives and the way that we actually navigate reality.
I might be a simpleton on this stuff, Fuqua, but I feel like when I came to philosophy, I was just really concerned about what was going on the campuses, and
Yeah.
I couldn't articulate it. I didn't have a theory about it exactly. I, I I mean, if you were pressed me on a theory, I would have said the communists are taking over, something like that. But and actually, I wasn't too far wrong about that. But
No.
um, the the big idea that really breathed fresh life into my studies and gave me a lot more energy to handle these try to plow through these really hard articles to read and stuff like that, have these kind of conversations that you have to have with philosophers the way they want to have them, was finding out there were common sense people in this industry, for lack of a better word, and that I had to figure out what they were saying and how they were saying it, who they were talking to. And that was a way for me to move forward and make sense of it in a way that I could understand. And then I could also appreciate enough to teach it for a long time, for many years. Because otherwise I couldn't, I would felt like I was hurting my students if I didn't link them with this common sense tradition.
Right, because that's gets back to the issue of whether philosophy really does deliver knowledge or not. And
Yeah. Right.
if
Whether
it
you're doing something productive or you're just
exactly
wasting time or
right,
actually hurting people. Yeah.
right, and if you assume, as the common sense tradition does, that human cognition is basically reliable, and that the truths of common sense are good starting points for deeper reflection, then you can get a body of knowledge from that. But if you assume the way that the skeptics do, that human cognition is basically unreliable, you're never going to get a body of knowledge using a set of faculties that are basically unreliable. So if philosophy is going to be profitable at all, it's got to be because we're drawing from this common sense tradition, which I would argue goes back at least to Aristotle, if not even further.
I
Um,
agree with you on that.
and
Yeah.
it's kind of a myth, I think, that common sense philosophy is goes back only to G.E. Moore or even only to Thomas Reid. There's a good British philosopher named Stephen Bolter, Boulter. Again, if any of your viewers want to go deeper on this, Bolter argues that the scholastics were common sense philosophers.
No way.
Yeah, it's he argues in a couple places. He's got a book called "Why Medieval Philosophy Matters." He's got a whole chapter in this
Ooh.
book on the meta philosophy of the scholastics, where he argues that basically they were common sense philosophers. And of course,
Stephen with a V or Stephen with a PH?
PH.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, and I think this goes right back to the to Plato and Aristotle, more so to Aristotle than to Plato. But um,
Oh, that's awesome.
yeah,
Thank you for that reference.
yeah.
Uh, Going back to evolutionary debunking,
Okay, yeah.
what's this have to do with evolution and
Okay,
how
good.
does and atheism too?
Right. So this work we're talking about today, Luke, it comes from these publications that ultimately are based on my dissertation. Um, and what I noticed as a PhD student is that I was really attracted to the common sense response to skepticism as the best one. And I was also very interested in ethics and specifically in moral epistemology. Like, how do we know moral truths?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of moral skepticism in our culture today, including in academic philosophy, unfortunately. And it seemed to me that a lot of moral truths were just as rationally secure as the ordinary Morian facts. Like, I know that I have hands, I know that I exist, I know that there are other people, etc. But no, it didn't seem to me that people had really been making this point in print. It was kind of a neglected way to respond to the moral skeptic, to argue that there are
That's,
moral facts that are also Morian facts, and
yes.
therefore that these ethical or meta-ethical Morian facts, they are just as immune to revision in the face of skepticism as my knowledge that I have hands is.
Right.
And so And so what this paper, Meta-Ethical Mormonism and Evolutionary Debunking, is articulating that argument. And so what I do is I argue basically that some of the Morean common sense facts are moral facts. And the example you alluded to earlier, raping children for fun is wrong. One example I give in another paper, which I mentioned earlier, is that recreational genocide is wrong. That comes from a paper in 2021 called Ethical Moreanism. And what I do is I argue that there's a kind of epistemic symmetry between common sense truths like I have hands, I exist, there are other people, and moral truths such as recreational genocide is wrong. And I outline several of these symmetries. And so let me just run through these in just you take maybe 60 to 90 seconds to run through some of these. So,
and you call it a Morean truth because just the name of the guy is named G.E. Moore.
Right.
And then you just add and you say what he said we could believe, which is what you already do believe.
Right.
We're just going to call that a Morean truth for the purpose of the philosophy paper. Okay.
Right. Exactly.
Gotcha.
So normal Morean facts are typically extremely plausible. They have a very high initial plausibility. So it's very plausible that I have hands. It's very plausible that other people exist. Likewise, the proposition that recreational genocide is wrong seems to me just to be about as plausible as anything else I could possibly believe. So that's and like the proposition that I exist or that I have hands, the proposition that recreational genocide is wrong is much more plausible or reasonable than anything the skeptic could tell me to the contrary. So that's the first symmetry.
Yeah.
Second symmetry is that neither type of proposition requires academic expertise to know. I don't need any kind of specialization or technical expertise to know I have hands, to know that there are other people, or to know that recreational genocide is wrong. They're both accessible to any properly functioning human being. A third epistemic symmetry is that both can be believed non-inferentially, or in Plantinga's terminology, in the properly basic way. That is, I can know that I exist without proving that I exist. I can know that I have hands without having a philosophical proof that I have hands. Likewise, it seems I can know that recreational genocide is wrong even if I can't prove it. So there's a third symmetry.
Yeah.
A fourth one is that both sorts of propositions are nearly universally endorsed. Almost everyone believes there are other minds. Very few solipsists out there.
Yeah.
And likewise, almost everyone believes that recreational genocide is wrong.
Right.
And then finally, in both cases, what we believe is so obviously true that we take it for granted. We don't even need to articulate it. Just like I don't go around telling people, oh, I have hands, or I exist, or there are other minds. Likewise, I don't go around articulating, hey, did you know that recreational genocide is wrong? Because I can expect that any properly functioning person will have a belief that it's wrong.
Let me just briefly press into that a little bit. You're saying, and feel free to press back because that's kind of the point of what I'm doing here. You're saying one way to look at what you're saying is there's a high degree of psychological certainty.
Yeah.
Okay. How do you respond to that? How do you add to that?
Yeah, so it's true that there is a high degree of psychological certainty, but it's just not subjective certitude. I would say that these common sense truths, we have more reason to believe that they are true than we do to believe what the skeptic is telling us.
Okay.
So take for example the proposition that I have hands. I can see that I have hands. That's perceptual evidence. I can feel that I have hands. That's another type of perceptual evidence. Other people tell me I have hands. That's testimonial evidence that I have hands. I can make predictions. Okay, if I have hands, I'm able to pick up this coffee cup. Oh, I picked up the coffee cup, therefore I do have hands, right? And so I've got a lot of reason to believe that I do in fact have hands. Now,
G.E. Moore didn't go through all that.
He didn't go through all that.
If you go to the original source, you read through that. He doesn't do that what you just did, but that was very helpful.
Thank you. He does say that I have certain evidence, or conclusive evidence is the way he put it, that I have hands. He said, even if I can't say what the evidence is, I have conclusive evidence.
Okay.
And think about this, that we can evaluate evidence without being epistemologists. If we couldn't, then the whole jury system, that trial by jury would be
screwed.
It'd be screwed, exactly. So G. Moore's like, look, I don't need a theory of evidence to know I've got very strong evidence for thinking that I have hands. Now, conversely, think about the Methodist requirement. Remember, that's one of the skeptics' principles, that you can only have knowledge if you know in advance that the method you use to arrive at a certain belief is reliable. Well, what reason do I have to believe that? I mean, the only reason I could possibly have is I have a rational intuition that it's true. Okay, that's some evidence. I think intuitions, I subscribe to the view that intuitions do provide us with evidence, but that's the only piece of evidence I have. I have no confirmational evidence. I can't make predictions on the basis of that and get more reason to think that it's true. I have no perceptual evidence that it's true, because it's an epistemic principle. It's not the sort of thing that you can get perceptual evidence for. I have no testimonial evidence that it's true, because most of the people who think about this principle are epistemologists, and most of them reject it. So I really have no reason to think that the Methodist requirement is true, except for the fact, if it's a fact, that might happen to seem to be true to me. But Luke, in my case, it doesn't even seem to be true. So I really have.
Did it ever seem to be true to you?
No, it never seemed to me to be true.
So I have to admit, it seemed to be true to me at one point.
Yeah,
I had to be converted.
So I think we do have more reason to believe the truths of common sense. It's not just psychological certitude. I would say there's the total evidence favors the truths of common sense over the skeptic's premises.
Well,
so and so then by extension, if certain moral truths are on epistemically on par with the non-moral common sense propositions, that gives us a good reason to think that they are also immune to revision in the face of philosophical arguments to the contrary.
Yes.
So that's the basic idea of what I call ethical Morianism.
What's evolutionary debunking?
Okay, so good.
You go through that, right?
Yeah. In this paper, I apply this meta-ethical Morian position to a specific moral skeptical argument, the evolutionary debunking argument. And this is a very popular argument among academic philosophers who are also moral skeptics. This is one of their favorite arrows in their quiver, so to speak. And the basic idea of the argument is that our moral beliefs are produced by natural selection, which is an off-track process, meaning that natural selection doesn't track the moral facts. It doesn't lead to the evolution of our moral faculties in such a way that those moral faculties are likely to track moral reality. What natural selection cares about, to personify it, is just simply reproductive fitness. It doesn't care about moral truth.
Yes.
And you can be reproductively fit without having a lot of true moral beliefs.
Right.
And so the thought is that it would just be a kind of miraculous coincidence if this off-track process just so happened to give us a reliable set of moral beliefs.
And what we mean by reproductive fitness, let's just say what that is.
Yeah, passing on your genes.
Yeah.
It's not,
any freshman in college that got an F in philosophy can do this, and got an F in biology and F in logic. And they probably are. And, unfortunately we have abortion in our culture. So that's not reproductive fitness in the sense of abortion, but in terms of like reproduction, right? That, we all know what's involved in that. It's as simple as that. It's that kind of act, and that's it. There's nothing else to it, right? And then enough food for the offspring, and safety, all the stuff that's necessary, oxygen, water, decent climate, and then they do the same thing, and just times a million.
Right.
That's what you mean by reproductive fitness.
Right. So
what's have to do with morality? In other words, what does that have to do with morality?
Yeah, so it seems to undermine if the argument actually works, it would undermine all of our moral beliefs, because in essence, the argument would give you a reason to think that your moral beliefs are produced by an unreliable cognitive faculty. a cognitive faculty that was produced by a process that cares not a whit for moral truth, but cares only about survival of the fittest or reproductive fitness. So,
yeah.
Okay, now from the common sense perspective, common sense epistemology perspective, the right thing to think here is that, no, wait a minute, I really do know that recreational genocide is wrong. And so the evolution debunking argument must be wrong somewhere. There must be some false premise, or maybe the argument's invalid, maybe the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises, but something is wrong with it. And that's exactly how a common sense epistemologist reasons in the face of external world skepticism. So the skeptic is telling me, I don't know that I have hands. Wait a minute, I do know that I have hands. So the skeptic is wrong somewhere. Let me figure out where. Likewise, ethical or meta-ethical moralism makes the same sort of move. And so what I do in the paper is I argue that when you actually look at the debunking argument, it actually turns out to be not very plausible. And that sort of is meant to redeem the common sense Morean claim that common sense facts are more plausible than skeptical premises to the contrary. So let me just lay out some of the problems with the evolutionary debunking argument.
Okay.
Problems that lower its plausibility. So one is what I call the too much skepticism worry, which is that it's very difficult to calibrate a evolutionary debunking argument in such a way that you get skepticism about moral beliefs, but not about other beliefs. So, Luke, you're probably familiar with Alan Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism.
Yes, it's been a few years, but yeah.
Yeah. So for your
spent some time in it. Yeah.
The basic idea of the argument is just that if our cognitive faculties in general are the product of naturalistic evolution, not theistic evolution, but naturalistic evolution,
sure. Yeah.
Then we have no reason to think that they're reliable, because what naturalistic evolution cares about, again, is reproductive fitness, not about truth.
Right. And let's pause really quick and just say that's the official line in public schools. That's
naturalistic
from my
evolution.
Because it's got to be that's my understanding of it, is that the understanding is that science cannot take any kind of cognizance the way it's taught in public schools, that science, or the way that it should be taught in public schools according to this view, whether a particular Christian biology teacher articulates it that way, I'm not, there's probably lots of examples that where they don't really hear to the view, but the view is that that science properly understood, and that's their view, that science properly understood cannot bring in any explanatory principle that's not a physical system or a physical property. So by definition, then, the supernatural would not count as a causal role in this for scientific purposes. And so therefore it wouldn't have anything to do in a biology classroom. Does that sound fair to you?
Sounds fair to me. And to the extent that evolution is taught that way in a public school, it's unwittingly sowing the seeds of radical skepticism in the minds of the students.
Yes.
Because the ultimate process, which leads to the evolution of the human mind, is a blind, impersonal, purposeless process that cares not one whit for truth.
Right.
Well, and if that's the process that produces your cognitive faculties in general, why think they're trustworthy? And so there's actually been people have argued in print that if Plantinga's argument works, if the evolutionary debunking argument against morality works, that implies also the success of Plantinga's argument, which undermines all of our cognitive faculties. But if all of our cognitive faculties are undermined, so are the ones we use to arrive at the truth of evolutionary biology itself. So are the cognitive faculties the debunker uses to arrive at her premises. So this debunking argument ends up being self-defeating at the end of the day. So that really, other philosophers, Luke, have argued that the evolutionary debunking argument also threatens to undermine the natural sciences. It threatens to undermine mathematics. It threatens to undermine epistemology itself. So,
and so at the beginning of the next day, because you said at the end of the day, So and then night goes, and then at the beginning of the next day, when you ask for funding for the legislatures for these institutions of higher education and K through 12, why should we give it more funding?
Right.
I mean, and just to bring it back to politics, but yeah,
Right.
all your stuff
Right.
you're saying is, by the way,
Yeah.
we're headed towards some political reflections after this. So
Yes, we are.
yeah,
Yes. So that's not. I mean, so that's one major concern with the evolutionary debunking argument. I think is that it
yeah,
implies a
okay,
very broad form of skepticism, which is ultimately self-defeating. But there are other empirical, what I call empirical worries about it too, which is one of which is that some of our moral beliefs are not what we would expect if those beliefs were actually the product of natural selection. So I point out in the paper that a lot of philosophers have argued that our morality, the morality that we think is correct, is strikingly more inclusive than what we would expect if those beliefs were just solely the product of natural selection. So, for example, we tend to believe today that all people, whether they are inside of our in-group or in some out-group, deserve respect. We tend to even think, even if we don't believe, even if we're not strong believers in animal rights, we do tend to think that animals do have some kind of value. For example, we would probably agree that it's wrong to torture animals for fun. And we believe that all people have basic natural rights that should be respected by their governments. But these sort of inclusive beliefs are not the sort of beliefs we would expect people to have if their moral beliefs were solely the product of natural selection.
Hmm.
So what this means is that at least some of our beliefs were not the product of natural selection, so that the evolutionary debunking argument wouldn't actually apply to all of our moral beliefs, but only would apply to some of our moral beliefs, even if it works. So it's not going to get the wholesale skepticism that the debunker actually is looking for.
right, gotcha.
But there are many other worries, some of which I discuss in this paper. One is that beliefs don't look to be genetically inheritable anyway.
Yeah.
And so you can't literally inherit moral beliefs from your genetic ancestors.
Mm.
Let's see. A final worry I'll mention. And again, if the viewers want more details, they can take a look at the paper. This paper, I think, is posted on my academia.edu account.
Okay, am I able to link something for everybody to click on
Yeah,
this if they want?
yeah, I can send you. I can send you links for the show notes or whatever.
Okay, cool.
A final worry I'll just mention is that it's not problematic to concede that evolutionary evolutionary factors might have influenced our moral beliefs. What the debunker needs is a stronger claim that we're not able to correct for those influences.
Hmm.
The debunker needs to show that not just that our moral beliefs were influenced by non-moral factors like fitness, but also that they were not influenced by moral factors. But how could evolutionary biology, a natural science, show that our moral belief formation was not guided by moral facts? That's not part of the competence or domain of evolutionary biology.
Yeah.
So
It's
I
a
think
category mistake, right?
it's a category mistake, exactly.
Yeah.
So when you look at the evolutionary debunking argument from the perspective of common sense epistemology, I think what you see is that there's much less reason to believe what the debunker is telling us than there is to believe that recreational genocide is wrong.
Yeah. Thank God.
Thank God.
Thank God. Wow. Hey, do you mind if we just can we get an idea of who you are and where you teach briefly?
Yeah.
Just people might see your haircut and think you're in the military, and they might just wonder basic things like, what is this guy? I mean, where do you live and stuff? Like,
Yeah.
which a little bit about, like, could just to show you're a normal human person
Yep.
and
I'm
you're
very
not like an alien or something.
No. I live in Northwest Missouri. I teach philosophy full time at Conception Seminary College, which is an undergraduate seminary. We train young men who are discerning priesthood in the Catholic Church. So they're all getting a bachelor's degree in philosophy, and I'm one of the philosophy professors at that seminary. And I'm been married for 20 years, and my wife and I have 5 children. Yeah, just a very normal guy who loves to think about these very difficult, perplexing, but fascinating questions.
You have books, and you have a file cabinet behind you, and you got a
Yep,
brick wall. Is that a real
yep,
brick wall, or is that
it's a
like
real brick wall.
okay.
Yep, sitting in the basement of my house here in Northwest Missouri, which is constructed in 1912.
What's the temperature like in that basement right now?
Oh, I don't know, but it feels really good. It's almost 100 outside.
Oh yeah, I bet. And it's
Um,
muggy, I bet. Muggy.
but I'm a very ordinary guy who just got interested in philosophy when I went to college, and a lot of the beliefs
Yeah,
I
your
grew up.
background is interesting because you were a jock.
I was a jock. Yeah.
You played football.
Yep. I went to philosophy. I went to college on a football scholarship. I was a PE major, and yeah, I was not very intellectual in high school at all.
College major was physical education, is that right?
Education. Yeah, I just want I wanted to go back, and when I was done college, I just wanted to be a PE teacher and a high school football coach. Um,
And those of you listening, if you take a look at Jonathan on the YouTube, you'll see, you see the jock still there. Do you still lift and stuff? Do you still
yeah,
work out?
yeah, I work out all the time. Yeah.
Nice, nice.
Um, uh, when I got to college, a couple things happened. The moral and religious beliefs I had grown up with were challenged by not just by fellow students, but by my professors, and they weren't mean about it, like in the God's Not Dead movies. They weren't mean about it.
Yeah.
They were very nice,
Right.
academic people I respected a lot, and they just raised objections to Christianity, for example, or some of my traditional moral beliefs, like that abortion was wrong. I didn't really know how to answer, and I realized that if I was going to um, answer their objections and think through these issues in a responsible way, I had to study philosophy.
Mhm.
Philosophy, for all of its seeming abstractness, arises out of very ordinary concerns. Like one thing we're debating in our country right now is the justice of affirmative action. Supreme Court recently handed down a decision that's very unpopular on the left. And underneath that constitutional debate, there's a moral debate, right? Is affirmative action just or unjust? Well, that depends. What's justice?
Mhm.
So to really settle the matter, you got to do moral philosophy, right? Or what happens to me when I die? That's something everyone thinks about. Well, that depends. Are you just a meat bag, or do you have a soul? Oh, well, how do I answer that question? Well, I got to do philosophy, right? Oh, what's the purpose and meaning of life? You can't answer that doing history or doing chemistry or accounting. You have to think philosophically
You
about
might
that.
have flashes of insight while you're studying those things, but
Yes,
what you're
yes,
saying is flash of insight is one thing. That's different than saying that the curriculum itself has as its subject matter
right,
the meaning of life, which it
right.
does not.
Which it
Okay.
does not. And then, so let's say you go to college and you're learning facts in chemistry class, you're learning a different set of facts in your psychology class, a different set of facts in your history class, and maybe you're studying world religions. How do you put all this together into a systematic, integrated view of reality? I mean,
That would be nice.
these other
That,
disciplines don't tell you that.
yeah.
They just give you piecemeal perspectives on this or that aspect of reality. But we want to know the truth about the whole and how it all hangs together, how it all fits together.
That's
Only
very
philosophy
attractive.
can tell you that.
That the way you just said that, that's very attractive about philosophy.
So yeah, so
Is
that's how I got into philosophy.
integrating it. Yeah. Yeah, what the heck? Does it all make sense when you look at everything? Or
Right.
is it just you have to close your mind? A lot of people believe that about religion. You have to, oh, you go to church? Oh, that's nice. And I think the assumption is kind of like you close your mind, or there's probably something weird and distorted in your soul. You have to close your soul and you go into this building and you do some weird stuff that makes you feel good.
Right.
And then when someone dies, it helps you in that
Right.
time. So it's all for you're probably hyper worried about that. And
Right.
then meanwhile, I'm just living my life.
We live very disintegrated compartmentalized lives, I think, in the modern world, where we if you go to church, or maybe you don't normally go to church, but maybe you go to church for a baptism or a wedding or a funeral, and that fulfills some need in your life. And then, but you might have a totally different set of beliefs that you operate out of Monday through Saturday, and then a totally different set of beliefs that you operate out of at work versus when you're at home. And so we have these very disintegrated, compartmentalized lives. I think that's in part because philosophy is not studied very widely in our culture anymore.
Yeah, and it's partly just a coping mechanism too. I mean, it's for dealing with very difficult circumstances. But yes, you're right. There's a deeper issue there, I think. Now, where did we cover all of the evolutionary debunking stuff yet? Or
I think we covered the main idea, yeah, that I want to get out on the table, which is that there's not very strong reasons to think that the evolutionary debunkers' premises are true.
yeah,
And so those premises are epistemically inferior to the common sense moral truth that recreational genocide is wrong.
I want to tell you a brief story. In 2015, I taught the most I'd ever taught. I made six figures as an adjunct professor that year.
Wow.
Back when making six figures meant something in Los Angeles, very quickly meant nothing with inflation and the crazy stuff that happened later. But I was working really, really hard, and it was excruciating. It was really excruciating, parts of it, mainly because it was so painful. It's hard to articulate because when you're working that much as an adjunct professor, you have such a wide variety of experiences. At least I did in Los Angeles. And though what I'm talking about with the pain is the worst experiences that I had, because there would be the worst classes like I've ever had. And where I saw the corruption of the campuses and the corruption of the culture, the decay of the culture, and how it's affecting students. Like, okay, I'll give you an example. At Los Angeles Pierce College in Los Angeles, I was using the example you gave of rape, knowing rape is wrong, knowing it's true that it's wrong, as an example. And I got pushback from the students. And so I did a class poll, and not a single student said that they believed that it's true that rape is wrong.
Wow.
And the disturbing thing about that year in 2015 is that was not the only time or the only school in Los Angeles where I had those results. And so, okay, a little bit of the etiology of the Republican professor. I just happened to notice I mean, you can't not notice as you walk through most college campuses that they're entirely Democrat. And in fact, at the time, I think it was like there was a libertarian professor of economics that was making some critical comments about the union or something. And I mean, they were raking her over the coals like she was a witch in New England in the 1600s. And I mean, she wasn't even a Republican. To say I mean, that's what I'm trying to say is she wasn't even the worst case. And I became really conscious that I was even, if I would have been widely known as a Republican, which I was eventually, but because I debated I debated abortion in front of the whole school at one point. And by the way, we won the debate. It was me and a Catholic guy. I'm Protestant, but this other guy has a PhD in philosophy. He's Catholic. I think he had a PhD from St. Louis, and we did a good job. And we were basically debating the pagans in front of the entire school. It was like 200 people there, and the college president and the trustees, and I think an elected official was there, like the assembly member or something. City council person was there, and a person from the student newspaper came up to me and said, I don't know if they ever ran a story on it. I didn't follow up, but the student writing for the student newspaper said he was shocked that we won. She was shocked. Like, and I was just like, it wasn't surprising to me at all. Like, but that's how compartmentalized people are in Los Angeles, that they all I was doing was integrating knowledge. That's what we were doing.
Right.
Anyway, so this issue of the students, I just noticed none of them were Republicans that were saying this. That's not true, that rape is wrong. And I started noticing these patterns, and it's not a scientific thing, it's anecdotal.
Right.
But I couldn't deny it in my experience, this profound sense that I was in the middle of a dark battle for the souls of people, and the soul, as it were, of the institution itself, which is really, it's not just the individual people, but it was the culture and the institution, like on a massive scale, not just this one, but this one and this one and this one. And I had this experience at Loyola Marymount too, which is supposed to be a Catholic school, where that same year, I think it was the same year, I had a particular student that had complained about me during the semester, and that wasn't normal, but it seemed to get more and more. I wasn't doing anything differently, but the students were changing, and the students were. We had this discussion in class about whether it's true that rape is wrong, and this girl was disagreeing with that in class, and I think she said that I made her feel uncomfortable or something like that. So I had these meetings or something. I was just like, you have to understand what we're talking about. We're talking about whether it's true that rape is wrong, and she's saying no. How do you think that makes me feel? Like,
right. Presumably, she thought it
who
was
am I
wrong for you to
talking
make
to,
her
Hitler?
uncomfortable.
Yeah, and so
But
it
unwilling to
was,
admit that rape is wrong.
yeah, and she immediately pulled a victim card, but it made no rational sense given what she was saying. Anyway,
Right.
it was just demonic. It was straight from the pit of hell, and I didn't really feel like the institution was doing a good job at all of protecting vulnerable faculty members. Of course, she wanted grade inflation too, and it's all tied together. So for me, this is a very emotional topic, because I've seen it firsthand, like really in Los Angeles. I've taught at 12 schools, and I've seen like a variety of different situations, like the private Christian schools and 5 community colleges, which are all government schools, 2 different big Cal states, and is that, I think that's it, right? Biola, Azusa, Pepperdine, Loyola Marymount, Cal Lutheran. So that's 5 community colleges. Yeah, so 12. Yep. So um I feel like I have in terms of anecdotes, a pretty wide sample, and I would say representative sample, because Los Angeles is incredibly diverse in terms of like real diversity. And so as I look at as I look at the college culture from that time, and I'm assuming it's very similar other places, um, this is a live, what we're talking about is like life and death for your soul, I think, and as well as for the health of our culture and our institutions.
Yeah. No, I think you're
So
right about that.
yeah, just want to share that. So do you want to say anything more about this paper? Or
No, I don't think so. Do you want to?
You want to go to the Trump paper?
Sure, we
Or
can do that. I
let,
there
let
is
me
an
let me pause it real quick. Hold on. So what does this all have to do with God's existence?
Okay, good question, because I think there is a connection that can be drawn here. Um, there's an argument for God's existence that used to be more popular than it is, called the common consent argument, or the consensus gentium argument for theism. And I think there's a connection with common sense epistemology. So common sense epistemology endorses the idea that widespread agreement that some proposition P is true is evidence that that proposition is true. And there's a philosopher who's been writing on this argument recently named Matthew Braddock. And he has a paper called Resuscitating the Common Consent Argument for Theism, where he names this idea that widespread agreement is evidence. He calls it the common consent principle. So notice that this common consent principle, first of all, before we get to any application to religious belief, it strongly favors common sense truths, because common sense truths enjoy widespread agreement.
Mhm.
Whereas skeptical premises, to the contrary, don't enjoy any agreement whatsoever. There's different skeptical arguments, so it's not like all the skeptics even agree amongst themselves about which skeptical premises they should be using to debunk common sense. So there's no higher order agreement about skeptical premises, but there's a lot of widespread agreement about common sense truths. That's one reason to think that common sense truths are epistemically superior to skeptical premises. Okay, now we can apply this idea of common consent as evidence to belief in God. And this is what Braddock has been doing in his published work. And he uses sociological research to argue that upwards of 90% of people throughout the world today believe in the existence of what he calls a high God. So high God is a God that creates and governs the world. And so belief in a high God is actually compatible with polytheism, as long as you posit a high God above the pantheon of gods. And in fact, most polytheistic people do posit kind of a supreme deity that kind of rules over the lower deities. And so if it's true that common consent or widespread agreement is evidence, widespread agreement that proposition P is true is evidence for P. And if it's also true that there's widespread agreement that a high God exists, that is a God who governs providentially the world, then there's strong evidence from this widespread agreement that such a high God does in fact exist. Now, this evidence could be the justification it provides could be defeated if there were good objections to belief in God. And so to make the argument, to sort of round out the argument, you have to sort of defend God's existence against some of the stock objections, which is a topic for a whole nother set of conversations, right? About the problem of evil and
Right.
whether theistic belief is formed by wishful thinking or by some other unreliable cognitive mechanism, or the rationality of religious belief in general, arguments for God's existence and all that stuff. But
Else when
yeah,
objections.
exactly. I just thought it was worth sort of flagging for viewers that this principle that we accept in everyday life, that widespread agreement favors something, when applied to theistic belief, strongly points in the direction of God's existence. So
That's awesome.
yeah, pretty cool.
That's awesome. Do you allow devices in your classrooms, like phones and stuff? How's that work?
At the beginning of the year, I always have to tell one or two students, hey, because I put in my syllabus and we talk about it on day one. I say no devices, take notes the old-fashioned way.
Oh, wow.
And I have to remind my students sometimes, once or twice at the beginning of the year, and after that, I don't have any problems with it.
That's great. Praise God. I wish I could do that. See, that kind of, I think there's something to that institutional support for classroom discipline.
Yes.
And at the K through 12, I think it's even more important, but it's still important in college. I don't know why people don't understand that. Anyway, okay, so let's get into your Trump paper. Let me find it really quick. I'm going to share the screen. So, well, you know, the version I have isn't really that fun to look at.
No.
I'm
So
not
this is
sure
a
if it would be that helpful to show it, actually.
so for your viewers, this is a forthcoming book chapter,
Okay.
and it's not the book is not published yet, but the it's in press, so it's
Mhm.
being worked on by the publisher as we speak. I'm not sure if it'll be out in 2023 or 2024.
You have a co-author on this.
I have a co-author on this, and a mutual friend of ours, and Shannon Holzer, who's been
Hmm.
on your show before, Luke, and we've both known Shannon for a very long time. He's a professor at Houston Christian University,
Hmm.
and really good guy and a good thinker. And yeah, we teamed up together to co-author this paper.
That's great.
And we wrote with, again, as with all publishing endeavors, the actual there's usually a gap between pretty sizable gap between the time you start working on something and the time it actually comes out.
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah.
sometimes 2, 3, 4, years or more. So Shannon and I
Wow.
started working on this paper. I want to say,
2004.
yeah, when we first met a while
People are
ago.
like, Trump, what are you talking about? Donald
It's
Trump?
been maybe at least 18 months, if not even
Gotcha.
longer. So
So what you're saying is the red uh strike out through that whole sentence, that's not going to be in the final
it's not going to be in the final.
publication.
Oh,
Oh, okay.
if Luke, if you pull that up on Microsoft Word and navigate your way to the review tab,
Okay.
you should be able to.
How do I do that?
Um, so, are you in Google Docs?
Yeah, I
Maybe
can
download
download
it.
it. Okay.
Yeah, or over here, it looks like. Uh,
Let me stop
yeah,
sharing really quick, and that way I can see what I'm doing here. Did it
yeah. So
download, or do
yeah,
I print it, or what do I do?
yeah. Download it as a Word document.
Okay.
Go to the review tab, and then go to the tracking tab, and then click the markup, and then hit no markup.
Do you use a Mac?
I use a Mac, yeah, but I type on Microsoft Word usually.
Okay. All right. Let me pull it up. It's pulling up as pages because I don't have Microsoft Word on my
No, I don't know
Mac.
if you'll be able to. I don't know if you'll be able to to do what I'm talking about then.
Okay. All right.
To
Well,
eliminate all the red. It's not a big deal.
yeah, the red's still
What
there. Red's still
what I need
there.
to do
So,
is just upload a copy of this to my academia.edu page, and then when we link to
all right.
your viewers, they
We'll
can
do
go
that.
on there and get a clean copy.
Okay. So you're talking about, and some people are rolling their eyes right now. They're like, "Oh, this all goes to Trump." Okay, all right, we now know what's going on here.
Yeah. Um,
This
and
is
so
what your real agenda
yeah,
was.
our real agenda. Um, the paper is not it's not really a defense of Trump per se. It's more a defense of Trump voters, and it's actually a very weak and qualified defense of Trump voters. Like Luke, as you know, academics sometimes will defend and will sometimes qualify their theses to death so that they end up defending something that's
Yeah,
some not nearly as controversial,
yeah,
and is therefore somewhat less interesting,
hmm,
honestly. So this
sure,
paper might fall under that criticism that it's very qualified. It's a defense of Trump supporters, and it's the thesis of the paper is that Trump supporters are not wicked or irrational just in virtue of supporting Trump.
right. And did you have
So
somebody in mind in your family when was it your Aunt Shirley, and that's what you thought of the whole time you're writing this?
so most
You're
of the
really defending your Aunt Shirley.
exactly. I mean, I know a lot of Trump voters who are just normal, everyday, ordinary, good people, and yet I also have a lot of academic friends, and then who act as though people who voted for Trump are somehow beyond the pale, right?
Yeah,
As if they must
right.
be idiots or bigots
Hmm.
just in virtue of supporting Trump. And of course, we know this is how the legacy media and a lot of politicians on the left treat Trump supporters as well.
Well,
And so,
I'll just add really quick that
yeah,
in my experience of NLA, I always smile when I hear people talk about like from the heartland here in Missouri, but when I'm in LA, every Republican was treated that way.
Yeah.
Every single one, besides maybe Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he was more like kind of mocked,
Right.
sometimes justifiably so, but George Bush was treated that way. Dan Quayle. I mean, I could keep going. Clarence Thomas. I cannot tell you the
Right.
vitriol. Brett Kavanaugh.
Yep.
Well, actually, okay. Let me go back before. John McCain. Um, Mitt Romney. I mean, I can't. So I would just point out, like, Mitt Romney became a gentleman and a statesman all of a sudden when Trump was elected.
Right.
And it's like, well, just a few years ago, you were saying he was a racist, and
Right.
it's
Yeah,
like,
I think it was in
yeah.
2012 when Biden said that it was Romney. I think it was Romney he had in mind wants to put African Americans back in chains. Well before Trump became a political figure,
Sure. And you're talking
Democrats
about
were
making it,
using
you're talking
Republicans as
about
one of
social. Sure. I mean, Paul Ryan is talking about social security reform, which is any rational person that knows anything about the federal budget and has any kind of attention span would think that should be the first thing you talk about.
right.
The entitlement reform, because it's 2/3 of the federal budget, actually a little bit more. And you're talking about 2/3 of the federal budget is transferring a dollar from this person's paycheck to another person, but in the middle, the government takes a chunk out for itself. And uh, the Democrats want that pie chart to grow more than 2/3. The Republicans want it to go less than 2/3. And I point out to my students that it can only go up to 100%. That it can't go past 100%. I don't know what you want to do with this discussion, and that is why that's why he's so evil. And I just, I couldn't believe it. He's Ayn Rand, this and that, and it's like, well, the facts on the ground are, and he was Catholic, so they
Right.
attacked that too. So
You
I
know,
mean, they were just, in my experience, they were. The Trump was worse, but not really that much worse, I would
right.
say.
Exactly.
Than
A lot of Trump's policies are just well within the mainstream of Republican politics in general.
sure,
and
sure.
and well within the mainstream of the American political tradition. If you go back before yesterday, I mean, we talked about in the paper how Senator Chuck Schumer, a Democrat from New York, voted for the Secure Fence Act in
Oh yeah,
2006, I believe it was, and called illegal immigration, wrong, plain and simple. That's a direct quote. No one accused Chuck Schumer of being a xenophobic, but Trump supporters are accused of being xenophobic for wanting strong
secure.
border security measures.
Yeah,
So yeah, you're right. So it's not a new problem. I think it's the problem seems to be getting worse. If anything, the culture of contempt that we inhabit, and people might be wondering what does this have to do with philosophy? Well,
hmm,
a couple things. Number one, the idea that Trump supporters are wicked is a moral judgment.
mm,
You're saying that they're wicked because they support unjust policies. You're making a moral claim. We can evaluate that claim on moral grounds using ethics.
mm.
If you're saying that Trump supporters are irrational, you're making an epistemic claim, an epistemology claim. So we can evaluate that claim on using the tools of epistemology. And so I thought the tools of philosophy here, specifically ethics and epistemology, could be utilized to try to argue that Trump supporters are not necessarily wicked or stupid just in virtue of supporting these policies. So that's kind of the
Yeah.
genesis of the
And you're talking about 2016 and 2020, not necessarily any future.
right. Not anything in the future. Like we're not
Right.
saying you should vote for Trump if you're a Republican primary voter, for example. We're not saying you should vote for Trump over DeSantis or Vivek Ramaswamy. That's not the end game.
That's helpful. Yeah,
And
just in
I
case
noticed,
anybody wasn't clear about that.
right? And another thing about another connection to philosophy is that in philosophy, people debate very controversial, very substantive issues like abortion,
Right.
or God's existence,
Capital punishment.
without capital punishment, without generally speaking demonizing each other.
Yeah.
And yet in politics, we demonize each other all the time. And so I'm sure that we could write a paper criticizing Republicans who demonize Democrats, but we chose to write a paper criticizing the demonization of Republicans by Democrats.
Because that's a lacuna.
We can have a calm disagreement about abortion. Why can't we have a calm disagreement about border policy?
Yeah, it makes sense.
So we argue this claim is false, that Trump supporters need not be considered wicked or irrational just in virtue of supporting Trump. Do you want to go through some of the arguments that we give?
Sure. And I was looking for the conclusion, but I don't think you had a conclusion section at the time.
No, we didn't.
But that's okay. We have a pretty good idea of what.
So kind of the first argument, well, we spent some time documenting in that section that's up there on the screen right there, section 2, demonizing Trump supporters. We spent a little bit of time documenting that these demonizations are really out there. We're not criticizing straw men. And then in section 3, critiquing the demonization of Trump supporters, we try to make our case that Trump supporters are not beyond the pale. They're not stupid or wicked just in virtue of supporting Trump. And there we give a few arguments. The first argument we give is that the claim that Trump supporters are stupid or immoral just in virtue of supporting Trump and his policies is a violation of the principle of charity. So the principle of charity says you should interpret your interlocutor, even if they're an opponent, you should interpret your interlocutor in the most charitable way possible. That is, in the best possible light. So you should try to steel man your opponent, not straw man your opponent. So let's take a couple of examples of this. So most Trump supporters are pro-life. There are at least 2 explanations that could be given for this. One is that Trump supporters just want to control women's bodies. Okay, that's a very uncharitable hypothesis.
Something charitable about it is that they know how to define the word woman correctly.
That's true.
Which you can't believe you have to add that now. But
yeah, you do. But there's another hypothesis which is charitable, even if it's incorrect from a philosophical standpoint. It's a charitable reading of why Trump supporters support his pro-life policies, which is that they care about unborn children. Now, both hypotheses would explain why certain people support Trump. I mean, I think one of the best things Trump has done, ever did as president, was his appointments to the Supreme Court, leading to the overturning of Roe. And that's one reason why a lot of people who didn't like Trump personally held their nose and voted for Trump, knowing that he may get the opportunity to make such appointments, and thus we may get the opportunity to overturn Roe. And that's exactly what happened. But it's uncharitable to claim that Trump supporters just really want to control women's bodies when there's another charitable hypothesis that would also explain their support for Trump. The other example I was thinking of is you see the same thing on the border. So most Trump supporters are in favor of strong border security on the southern border. Again, we have two hypotheses that could explain that. One is that they're xenophobes, right? Bigotry. Another hypothesis is that they care about border security because they're worried about crime, national security, the rule of law, human trafficking, national sovereignty, right? These are all perfectly legitimate, plausible reasons to favor border security. So again, which hypothesis is the most charitable interpretation of Trump supporters? That they're all xenophobes, or that they have legitimate, plausible reasons for wanting to have a secure southern border?
Yes.
So again, if you're going to operate according to the principle of charity, you should interpret your opponents in the most charitable light, which means that you shouldn't be claiming Trump supporters just want to control women's bodies. You shouldn't be claiming that Trump supporters are just xenophobic. So that's one argument we give.
Yeah. That's good.
Another one that we give is that we say that the demonization of Trump supporters is epistemically unjustified.
Mhm.
And here we draw on some research in philosophy and social science to argue that human beings in general are not always very reliable at accurately stereotyping people and their outgroups. So we're sort of tribalistic by nature, or at least by virtue of the nature we possess by as a result of our fallenness, the woundedness of original sin. Just to put it theologically for just a minute, we tend to be sort of tribalistic by nature. We tend to sort ourselves into in groups and out groups, and we tend to negatively stereotype people who are in out groups. And these negative stereotypes are often mistaken. And so, and the reason for this is that what we tend to do is create epistemic bubbles, and where we live in very different epistemic worlds from those who have a different outlook on the world. And so what that means is that we're not always very good at understanding why our opponents do what they do and think what they think.
Yeah.
And so based on this, and based on sort of how divided we are, and the fact that we inhabit these very different epistemic bubbles or epistemic worlds these days, we argue that someone on the left who claims that a Trump supporter really just wants to control a woman's body, or really is just xenophobic, probably is not epistemically justified in making that claim. What they're doing is they're engaging in a negative stereotype of someone in an outgroup that they don't personally know, and they're actually ignoring all the stated reasons that Trump supporters give for supporting Trump.
That's right.
And they're claiming to know the deep, dark, bigoted secrets of the hearts of these Trump supporters that they don't know at all.
Yes.
And we argue that this is irrational. And an example that we talk about in this part of the paper, Luke, is the way that the MAGA phrase is treated. So, "Make America Great Again."
Yeah, that's good.
Trump slogan.
Yeah.
So a lot of Trump's critics argue that people who support the MAGA phrase just want to put African Americans back under the Jim Crow regime or something like that. And that's not it. That's an uncharitable explanation. Yeah, when a Trump supporter wears a MAGA hat, I guess it's possible that he's really motivated by a desire to put African Americans back into a Jim Crow regime. Or it could be, a much more charitable reading would be that what this person wants is to reverse some aspect of decline, and wants to make America excellent in the way that is being lost as a result of this decline. And there are lots of ways in which America has declined that we should try to reverse, like our education system is not nearly as strong as it used to be. So if you really care about education, you're going to want to make America great again. What does that mean for you? It means we want to restore America to being having the best educational institutions in the world. That's what we wouldn't want to put black people back in chains.
Right.
And so,
well, when they were enchained, let me just interject a really quick point here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Which is demonstrably false. I mean, I love pointing this out when I teach constitutional law, by the way. When I have my students read Otis McDonald versus Chicago in 2010, now this is before Trump, but this is related to Bush and related to the Senate races that you see, because George Bush put these people on the court, like Brett Kavanaugh. He put Brett Kavanaugh on the D.C. Circuit. He put Neil Gorsuch on the D.C. Circuit. He elevated Samuel Alito to the Supreme Court and John Roberts to the Supreme Court. And his dad appointed Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court. That's George Bush. And in 2010, there was a black man that sued the city of Chicago because he wanted a gun for self-defense, because the police, and they admitted this in the record, were not there. There was like 15 to 23 minutes of a wait, and oftentimes it was longer than that. and what could go wrong in 15 minutes. Usually you're making the call after something has gone already wrong. It's not before. And he's in a rough neighborhood, and he's black in the city of Chicago. And the city of Chicago spent millions of dollars fighting him for him to be disarmed. And I only point this out because the segregation, well, let's go back further to slavery. A slave by definition is disarmed. I mean, so I always like to ask my question to my students this way. If slaves had guns, okay, it's kind of far out. You got slavery, no guns. If the slaves had guns, would there have been slavery in the United States? And I don't know of any student that has ever said, yeah, I would have continued. So anyway, and you might say that's the Republican Party then, this is now. No, it's the same principle, because it's Republicans on the Supreme Court that ruled for Otis McDonald in 2010. Well, then you have an application of that, and this is where it gets to Trump. And to your point about abortion, it's also about guns. The same majority that overruled Roe applied Otis McDonald's decision in 2010 against the state of New York, which wanted to disarm black vulnerable people that were victims of crime. And I would say that if you're like a slave on a plantation, you're a victim of crime. That's how I look at you, and you can't defend yourself. And it's the same exact thing. So to your point, I'd say it's demonstrably false that we want to go back in time. We're actually just trying to apply the gains and the progress.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, and I think the principle of charity demands that you interpret people like us, our political views, in ways like that, as opposed to just accusing us of bigotry.
Hmm.
And there's, we might say that if something is obviously true, to take this back a little bit to epistemology, then maybe you don't need evidence for it. Evidentialists would disagree, because they think you need evidence for everything. But let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that if something is obviously true, you don't need evidence for it. Well, it's not obviously true that Trump supporters are xenophobic or misogynistic in virtue of supporting border security or opposing abortion. And so what that means, that you need evidence for that claim. But what is your evidence that Trump supports, just in virtue of supporting border security or the Second Amendment or opposing Roe, are therefore bigoted? I don't see any evidence for that. It's a baseless accusation.
Gotcha. Okay. So they're ignoring evidence that would go against their view,
right?
And they don't really have much evidence, if any, for their view in the first place.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Right.
That's paradigm example of lack of substance there.
We go on to argue that Trump's policies are not obviously immoral.
Mm-hmm.
It's not obviously immoral to think that our border should be secure. There are scholars who argue for open borders. We cite some of those scholars, but we also point out other scholars who argue for the morality of having a secure border, that it's perfectly morally permissible and well within the confines of justice for nation states to control their borders.
Yes.
That's not an outlandish view. It's not outlandish to think that you shouldn't kill unborn innocent children, and that the thing in the womb is an unborn human child. That's not, it may be incorrect at the end of the day. I mean, I don't think it is, but it's not outlandish. It's not immoral. It's not crazy. It's well within the realm of moral discourse.
I don't think anybody's surprised when a human comes out.
No, exactly. So we argue that again, well, I don't even really know what Trump thinks about gay marriage. My understanding is he has no desire to overturn that, but
mm-hmm.
That's another example of, at least going back a few years, which was a hotly debated political topic, in which a
Yeah.
lot of people who supported Trump now also stood for traditional marriage before Obergefell. The idea that marriage is
Otherwise just known as marriage.
otherwise just known as marriage, and the idea that marriage is a heterosexual institution by nature, even if it's wrong at the end of the day. I don't think it is wrong. I think it's right. But even if you think it's wrong, it's not a wicked view. It's a view that almost every person on the face of the planet held for all of human history. It can be defended by plausible arguments.
I'll just add really quick an anecdote that builds on my previous anecdote of the 2015 chaotic year that I had, the traumatic year that I had emotionally because of the students saying it's not true that rape is wrong. I did a follow-up question because that was the year that Obergefell came down, and it was in the press in the spring, and then the summer it came down, and I taught all through the whole year. So the people that said that it's not true that rape is wrong, they were the same people that wanted to redefine marriage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's
And
that's
I'm just like, making connections here. I'm just, I'm noticing people that say traditional marriage.
right.
I never said the word traditional before marriage any more than I say the word traditional before apple, or traditional before man, or traditional before grass, or I'm not talking about
Right.
weed. I'm talking about traditional grass. Um, you know, it's like that integration thing that you mentioned earlier. Okay, so
Yeah.
I'll shut up now and let you move on with what you're saying.
Um, the fundamental point in this part of the paper that we make, I think, near the end of the section, is that we argue that having a false moral belief doesn't make you a wicked person.
Okay. Yeah.
So even if Trump
Makes sense.
supporters are wrong in the moral reasoning that they use to arrive at their policy positions, that doesn't make them terrible people. Again, in philosophy, we have moral arguments all the time. And I don't accuse my pro-choice philosophy friends of being wicked people just in virtue of having a mistaken view of abortion. I think it's a serious mistake, a consequential mistake, but just in virtue of making that philosophical mistake, I don't accuse them of being wicked people or immoral people or bigots in some way. And so I think even if you're a Democrat and you think that Republicans are wrong, morally speaking, you shouldn't therefore impute to them moral vice on that account alone.
Yeah, and I think my experience with Democrats, I would say, is that's generally true. They're just generally regular people. Now, something happens
Right.
when you get onto the college campuses, or when you go into a newspaper room or something, or in Hollywood, I guess. There's certain cultural institutions where it seems like, and I'm just trying to be descriptive here. I'm not trying to be evaluative. I'm just saying the phenomenology seems to be that certain cultural institutions like Hollywood, like the press, like the media, like the academic quote unquote higher quote unquote um, education system, or even K through 12 to a lesser extent, I guess, but they feel like they have a right to rule those with an iron fist. And it's not said that way, but if you pay attention for like 5 seconds, that's clearly the best explanation for what you see, because they don't have any Republican friends at all, or at least they would never admit it.
Right.
They act like that Republicans basically don't exist except for over there.
Right.
And that they, take for example how California, as a matter of public policy, treated red states. They made it was against public policy of the state of California to subsidize official travel for years,
Mm-hmm.
and to other states. Because why? Oh, because they believe in traditional marriage, or because
Right.
they Like, for example, Arizona wanted to secure the border.
Right.
And I didn't see red states doing that to California.
Right.
There was a very real difference. And it was, I mean, California, sorry, I'm so traumatized being here, but like people just keep telling me, move, move. Well, I'm kind of a missionary here. So
Yeah.
that's not
Yeah.
an option for me.
Yeah. You're doing good work.
Yeah.
Not
Thanks,
not
man.
every good person can leave their can or should leave their home and migrate somewhere else.
Yeah.
Um,
That's the demonization that I was saying well before Trump.
right.
It was to any Republican.
Right.
And, and, it's just this feeling that no, we have a right to rule this campus.
Right.
You'll only see certain stickers. You'll only
Right.
see the rainbow sticker or the communist sticker or the Kavanaugh sticker or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
The coexist sticker.
yeah, or the don't deport my students
Yeah.
posters
Yeah.
plastered all over Loyola Marymount University.
I mean, what you're raising, Luke, is that problem, the epistemic bubble, I think, right? Is that our many of our universities are epistemic bubbles on
Yeah.
on the left side of the aisle. Many of our elite institutions are also epistemic bubbles. Mainstream legacy media companies are epistemic bubbles. Academia is an epistemic bubble, and so I think you're right. A lot of these people don't really know any Trump supporters, because if they did, they wouldn't say the things they say about Trump supporters. If these people knew my neighbors and people in my family, people that I've known my whole life, and saw how good they are, that they're just normal people that have reasonable views, you wouldn't say these things about them just because they supported Trump. And so I think they're just making claims they're not justified in making.
Where's this going to be published?
I don't know the name of the book.
You shopping? Oh, it's going to be in a book. Okay.
It's going to be in a book. It's going to be a book chapter. The editor is Joseph Prudhomme, who's a political science professor at Washington College.
Okay.
And I believe the publisher is Rowman and Littlefield.
Oh, that's an academic press. That's a standard
Yeah.
one. That's great.
Yeah.
Great. Maybe people will read it.
I hope so. The paper of mine that has gotten the most attention is one that I didn't publish in a philosophy journal. It's one that Shannon and I published in the Oxford Journal of Law and Religion. It was about religious belief in American politics. The title is Courting Epistemology. It came out in 2014.
Oh yeah, I remember that one. I read that one. You're talking about how religion is used in like First Amendment.
It's how a lot of Supreme Court cases have. Well, it's about how a lot of jurists, including Supreme Court justices, have taken a very negative view of religion, and we defend the rationality of religious belief in the face of that negative view of religious belief as essentially just mere opinion that can't rise to the level of knowledge or rational belief.
Wow.
But these type of arguments where you take the philosophy and sort of apply it to a concrete issue that people are interested in, those arguments seem to get a lot more traction, or at least a lot more attention, than the purely kind of abstract philosophy stuff. So we're hoping this paper will get some attention like that one did as well.
Well, I'm thinking that this is part one of at least two parts with Jonathan here, because he has other work that we're going to dip into. And so we want to get the Trump stuff in today. It's not all on Trump. This is the only thing you've written on Trump, but there's some other really interesting things, some other sets of issues that we'd love to get into later. And so we're going to have Jonathan come back on, and I'm assuming he's going to change his clothes. So it's going to be a real different session, and we're not going to record everything today. So sometimes I change my tie if I have two in the same day, just so it looks like it's a different day.
Yeah.
But we really appreciate you coming on, and it's really cool to talk to. You're definitely the first professor we've had on that teaches with monks. Like you have like real monks.
Yeah.
Around.
Yeah. A lot of most of my colleagues are in fact Benedictine monks. Yeah.
Is that as cool as it sounds? I mean, I don't know.
it's really a wonderful place to work, Conception Seminary College, where I teach. To be surrounded, it's an intellectual community of people who are all pursuing the truth because they love the truth. They love the Lord. They love their students, and there's just a kind of brotherhood that exists on our campus. It's a beautiful thing to be a part of, and the students are very serious about their studies. Generally speaking, they're there to learn. They're there to absorb the Christian intellectual tradition as best they can, and yeah, it is as cool as it sounds.
That's awesome. Well, thanks, Dr. Jonathan Fuqua. I still
Yep,
screwed it up.
Fuqua. That's all
Fuqua.
right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jonathan, thank you for walking us through common sense philosophy, common sense epistemology, and some of these really thorny issues here.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.